The interrogation room at Fort Hunt. Virginia was quiet except for the scratching of pencil on paper. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Bargsten sat across from Lieutenant Commander John Riheldaffer on September 19th, 1943, answering questions about his service aboard U-563. Bargsten had been captured 3 weeks earlier when destroyers from the HMS Keppel sank his submarine west of the Azores. 31 of his crew died. 12 survived. Riheldaffer worked through standard questions about equipment, tactics, patrol routes. Then he opened a folder and slid a typed document across the table. Convoy statistics. North Atlantic. January through August 1943. Total merchant vessels in convoy, 2,847. Ships sunk by U-boats, 31. Loss rate, 1.09%. Bargsten stared at the numbers for nearly a minute without speaking. Then he pushed the paper back and said it was impossible. Allied propaganda. The praise. Mathematics couldn't work. German U-boats had been sinking merchant ships at rates exceeding 20% throughout 1942. Convoys had been losing 5 to 10 vessels per crossing. The Battle of the Atlantic had been Germany's one campaign where victory seemed inevitable through simple attrition. Riheldaffer added 3 more pages to the pile. Detailed convoy records. Individual ship manifests. Arrival reports from Liverpool, Halifax, and New York, showing vessel names, cargo tonnages, and dates. The documentation was comprehensive enough that fabrication would have required an intelligence apparatus larger than the actual convoy system. Bargsten read through the reports with increasing agitation. He demanded to know why German naval intelligence had reported Allied shipping losses, totaling 600,000 tons, monthly through spring 1943, when these statistics showed barely 100,000 tons lost. The interrogator had no satisfactory answer, because the question revealed the fundamental disconnect that broke the German submarine force. What U-boat commanders believed about their effectiveness bore almost no relationship to reality. The gap between perception and truth had become so vast that showing submariners' actual statistics triggered psychological crisis rather than acceptance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The statistical deception had roots extending back to 1941, when convoy defense technology began improving faster than German intelligence could track. British escort vessels received high-frequency direction, finding equipment that could locate submarines through their radio transmissions. Coastal Command aircraft deployed ASV Mark III radar, operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths that German METOX receivers couldn't detect. American shipyards started producing escort, carriers that put aircraft over convoys in the mid-Atlantic gap, where submarines had previously operated with impunity. Each technological advantage compounded the others. HF, DF detected submarines radioing convoy positions. Escort carriers launched aircraft to those coordinates. The aircraft forced U-boats underwater where they were slow and vulnerable. Destroyers then attacked with Hedgehog mortar systems that killed submarines at rates 5 times higher than conventional depth charges. The entire system functioned like industrial machinery, converting submarine contacts into kills with brutal efficiency. But German submarine commanders only saw fragments of this machinery in action. A U-boat attacked by aircraft couldn't know whether that aircraft came from a land base or an escort carrier 200 miles away. A submarine detecting radar couldn't determine whether it was the old 1.5-meter system or the new 10-centimeter wavelength. Commanders forced underwater by destroyer attacks couldn't tell if escorts were using HF, DF, or visual detection, or random search patterns. The result was that U-boat captains developed explanations for their difficulties that made tactical sense but missed the strategic reality. They attributed increased aircraft contacts to expanded land-based patrol ranges. They assumed radar detection came from improved versions of systems they knew about. They believed destroyer effectiveness reflected better training rather than revolutionary weapons like Hedgehog. Each explanation was plausible enough that it didn't trigger alarm at headquarters. Admiral Karl Dönitz received patrol reports describing difficult conditions and increased Allied activity, but nothing suggesting fundamental technological disadvantage. His intelligence staff analysed the reports and concluded that British defences had improved incrementally through natural wartime development. The staff saw no evidence of breakthrough technologies because they were specifically looking for impossible things. Radar operating on wavelengths German engineers said couldn't generate sufficient power, direction-finding equipment sensitive enough to locate submarines from radio emissions lasting seconds, or mass-produced escort carriers that naval architecture said couldn't be built quickly enough to matter. The intelligence failure created a feedback loop where each incorrect assumption reinforced others. If aircraft were coming from land bases, then submarines needed to operate farther from shore. If radar had simply improved, then existing countermeasures would eventually work. If escorts were just better trained, then experienced U-boat commanders could still achieve kills through superior tactics. Headquarters kept sending submarines into the Atlantic with tactical guidance based on assessments that were fundamentally wrong. Meanwhile, convoy defense effectiveness was climbing toward levels that made submarine warfare mathematically unviable. In January 1943, convoys crossing the North Atlantic suffered roughly 6% losses. By March, that figure dropped to 3%. In May, during the period when 41 U-boats were destroyed, convoy losses fell below 2%. By August, when Bargsten was captured, the loss rate had reached 1%. The critical threshold occurred somewhere between 3 and 2%. Above that rate, Germany could sustain submarine operations because training new crews and building replacement boats cost less than the value of merchant ships destroyed. Below 2%, the economic equation reversed. Each U-boat lost represented more value than the tonnage it sank before destruction. The submarine force was consuming resources without generating equivalent damage to Allied logistics. Dönitz understood this arithmetic in abstract terms. He knew that if U-boats couldn't maintain certain kill ratios, the campaign would become unsustainable. What he didn't grasp, until far too late, was that those ratios had already collapsed. His intelligence staff reported sinking figures based on commander claims that couldn't be verified. When a submarine radioed that it had torpedoed a 7,000-ton tanker, that kill entered German statistics as confirmed. The submarine couldn't remain surfaced long enough to verify the ship actually sank. It couldn't check whether that burning vessel limped into port for repairs 3 days later. British Admiralty knew the true figures because they counted ships that arrived versus ships that departed. When convoy ONS 5 left Liverpool with 43 vessels and arrived in Halifax with 30 ships, the Royal Navy recorded 13 losses. When German submarines claimed 19 ships sunk from that convoy, Dönitz accepted the higher number because he had no way to verify the discrepancy. The overcounting error compounded across hundreds of convoys until German assessments of U-boat effectiveness existed in a fantasy realm completely disconnected from Allied reality. The psychological impact on submarine crews emerged slowly as the war progressed. Commanders who survived multiple patrols began noticing patterns that contradicted official narratives. They'd attack convoys where headquarters said defences were weak, only to face overwhelming air and surface opposition. They'd operate in areas designated as safe, then get surprised by escort carriers that weren't supposed to exist in those waters. They'd use tactics that had worked brilliantly in 1942, only to find those same approaches producing catastrophic losses in 1943. Experienced U-boat captains started questioning whether headquarters understood what was actually happening in the Atlantic. Junior officers wondered why their training emphasized tactics that seemed obsolete against current Allied technology. Ordinary crew members simply tried to survive patrols that were statistically more likely to end in death than successful return to base. The entire submarine service began suffering from institutional confusion about what they were accomplishing and whether continued operations made any strategic sense. The confusion intensified after May 1943, when Dönitz withdrew U-boats from North Atlantic convoy routes following catastrophic losses. The withdrawal was supposed to be temporary, lasting only until new technology like the Naxos radar detector could be deployed. But when submarines returned to the Atlantic in autumn with improved equipment, the results were even worse. Escort carriers had proliferated. Very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap completely. Hunter-killer groups actively sought submarines instead of just defending convoys. U-boat crews found themselves operating in an environment where survival required constant vigilance and near-perfect execution of doctrine that was fundamentally inadequate against Allied capabilities. The average patrol lasted 6 to 8 weeks. During that time, submarines might spend 70% of each day submerged to avoid aircraft, running on battery power that limited speed to 4 knots. When they surfaced to recharge batteries, they faced immediate attack by aircraft with radar the Germans couldn't detect. When they transmitted position reports, HF-DF stations would triangulate their location within minutes. The operational stress created psychiatric casualties at rates that troubled German naval medical staff. Submarine crews began showing symptoms of what modern psychiatry would classify as combat stress reaction or acute anxiety disorder. These symptoms included sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, inability to concentrate, and emotional numbing. Some commanders became so risk-averse they'd abort patrols at the first sign of Allied opposition. Others became recklessly aggressive, taking suicidal chances to achieve kills that might justify the suffering they'd endured. Headquarters tried to address morale problems through propaganda, emphasizing U-boat heroism and strategic importance. Returning crews heard speeches about how their sacrifices were preventing Allied invasion of Europe. They received medals, promotions, and leave time. But no amount of propaganda could counter the cognitive dissonance created by being told they were winning a campaign while watching boats disappear at rates exceeding 50% annually. By late 1943, German submarine training centers were graduating crews who'd heard stories from survivors about conditions in the Atlantic. New submariners knew they were joining a force with catastrophic casualty rates. They understood that most boats didn't return from their first patrol. They'd been trained in tactics that veterans said no longer worked and equipped with technology that survivors said was inadequate. The institutional knowledge that might have helped them survive had disappeared along with the experienced crews killed during May 1943. The final breaking point for many German submariners came not during combat but during interrogation after capture. Allied intelligence officers would show prisoners actual convoy statistics, detailed loss reports, and economic analyses demonstrating that U-boat operations had achieved virtually nothing after mid-1943. The confrontation with reality was often more psychologically devastating than the combat that preceded it. Klaus Bargsten's reaction to the convoy statistics at Fort Hunt reflected a pattern that interrogators documented across dozens of captured submariners. Initial denial, then anger at being shown what they believed was propaganda, then confusion as they examined documentation too detailed to fabricate, then a kind of numb acceptance as they processed implications of having risked their lives repeatedly for a campaign that had failed completely. Some prisoners rationalized the statistics by claiming their own patrols must have been exceptional failures while other submarines achieved better results. Others argued that even 1% losses still represented significant tonnage and therefore meaningful contribution to the war effort. A few refused to accept the numbers entirely, insisting Allied records must be falsified regardless of apparent authenticity. The interrogators found that showing captured submariners the truth about convoy success rates was often more effective than traditional questioning techniques. Once prisoners understood how completely U-boat operations had failed, they became more willing to discuss technical details and tactical procedures. They'd answer questions about equipment specifications and operational doctrine because that information no longer seemed strategically valuable. Why protect secrets about a weapon system that demonstrably didn't work? The interrogation transcripts from Fort Hunt and similar facilities revealed something that Allied naval intelligence found deeply troubling. German submarine crews hadn't simply been defeated by superior technology. They'd been defeated while operating under institutional delusions about their effectiveness that persisted until individual submariners were captured and confronted with reality. The German Navy had continued sending men into hopeless situations based on assessment failures so profound that even frontline commanders couldn't identify them. British Admiralty analysts studied the interrogation reports and tried to understand how German naval intelligence had failed so completely. The consensus explanation involved several compounding factors. First, German assessment methods relied too heavily on submarine commander reports that couldn't be independently verified. Second, British deception operations had successfully convinced German intelligence that Allied technologies like centimetric radar weren't operational when they'd actually been deployed for months. Third, Dönitz himself had invested too much personal reputation in submarine warfare to objectively evaluate evidence that the campaign had become unsustainable. The result was an intelligence failure with few historical parallels. German U-boat command continued operations through 1944 and into 1945, while Allied convoy losses remained below 1%. Submarines that might have been preserved for defensive operations around European waters were instead sent into the Atlantic, where they achieved nothing except adding to casualty statistics. Resources that could have supported other military programs were consumed by a submarine construction program, building boats that had virtually no chance of surviving their first patrol. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The economic costs were staggering. Germany constructed approximately 700 U-boats during the war, at an average cost of 6 million Reichsmarks each. That represented roughly 4.2 billion Reichsmarks total, equivalent to about $24 billion in 2023 currency. After mid-1943, the majority of those submarines achieved virtually no strategic return on investment. They sank minimal tonnage, tied down modest Allied resources, and were destroyed at rates that made the entire program catastrophically wasteful. The human costs were worse. German submarine service suffered approximately 30,000 deaths out of 40,000 men who served, a casualty rate of 75%. Most of those deaths occurred after May 1943, when the campaign had already been lost strategically. Submariners continued dying in operations that headquarters knew were producing negligible results, but couldn't acknowledge had failed completely. Individual boats told the story, in microcosm. U-463 departed Brest on August 1, 1943, for her first patrol. The crew consisted of 48 men, average age 22, trained at submarine schools in Germany over the previous 12 months. The boat carried 14 torpedoes, provisions for 8 weeks at sea, and equipment including the new Naxos radar detector that was supposed to protect against Allied centimetric radar. U-463 operated in the North Atlantic for 17 days, before being detected by an escort carrier aircraft on August 17. The submarine crash-dived and evaded the initial attack, but the aircraft vectored destroyers to the location. The destroyers attacked with Hedgehog mortars for 3 hours, until one spread scored direct hits. The submarine imploded at 400 feet depth. There were no survivors. Total tonnage sunk by U-463. 0 merchant ships. Cost to Germany: approximately 6 million Reichsmarks plus 48 trained crew members. That pattern, repeated hundreds of times through late 1943 and into 1944. Submarines would depart French bases, operate for 2 to 6 weeks while achieving minimal or no success, then be destroyed by Allied anti-submarine forces. The few boats that survived their first patrol faced steadily worsening conditions on subsequent patrols as Allied capabilities improved and German situational awareness remained frozen in outdated assessments. The disconnect between German perception and Allied reality created situations that would have been darkly comedic if they hadn't cost thousands of lives. U-boat headquarters would designate certain convoy routes as lightly defended based on intelligence assessments from early 1942. Submarines sent to those routes would encounter escort carriers, destroyer screens, and continuous air patrols that made attacks suicidal. The commanders would radio reports describing overwhelming opposition in supposedly weak areas, but headquarters would interpret these reports as indicating that specific convoys happened to receive extra protection, rather than recognizing that all convoys now operated with capabilities that made submarine attacks virtually impossible. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer commanded U-333 through multiple patrols in 1943 and 1944. His war diary entries revealed the growing desperation of experienced commanders who understood they were being sent to accomplish missions that technology had rendered impossible. On October 12, 1943, Kremer wrote that his boat had been forced underwater 16 times in 24 hours by aircraft that appeared without radar warning. He noted that his crew was exhausted from constant crash dives and that battery power was so depleted they could barely maintain depth control. 3 days later, Kremer encountered a convoy roughly 200 miles west of Ireland. Standard doctrine called for, surfacing at night, positioning ahead of the convoy, and attacking from darkness where visual detection was impossible. Kremer attempted this approach and immediately found himself illuminated by searchlights from an escort carrier aircraft using radar to locate his submarine. He crash-dived and spent the next 4 hours evading depth charge attacks. When he finally surfaced after midnight, another aircraft appeared within minutes. Kremer wrote in his diary that it felt like Allied forces could see through water and darkness, that there was no longer any place submarines could hide. The diary entry concluded with a sentence that captured the psychological state of German submarine crews by late 1943. "We are ghosts, haunting an ocean that no longer has room for us." Kremer survived the war, one of the relatively few U-boat commanders who completed multiple patrols without being killed or captured. His survival came partly through skill and partly through increasingly cautious tactics that prioritized staying alive over achieving kills. By 1944, experienced commanders like Kremer understood that their primary mission had become bringing their crews home rather than sinking merchant ships. Attack opportunities that might have been taken in 1942 were passed up in 1944 because the risk-to-reward ratio had become untenable. This shift in commander psychology created another layer of distortion in German assessment of the campaign. Headquarters would send submarines to patrol areas with instructions to attack specific convoy routes. Commanders would reach those areas, observe the overwhelming Allied presence, and decide that discretion was preferable to suicide. They'd remain submerged, avoid detection, and eventually return to base having fired no torpedoes. The headquarters staff would note that the patrol produced no results but wouldn't understand that even experienced aggressive commanders had concluded attacks were pointless. The few submarines that did achieve kills in late 1943 and through 1944 typically succeeded through exceptional circumstances rather than effective tactics. U-545 sank the British destroyer HMS Warwick on February 20, 1944, but only because the destroyer had been damaged by another submarine and was operating alone while limping back to port. U-1024 sank 2 merchant ships from Convoy H, X-305, on September 19, 1944, but the convoy had become scattered during a storm and those particular vessels had fallen behind their escorts. These occasional successes appeared in German statistics as proof that submarine operations remained viable. Dönitz would cite them during meetings with Hitler to argue for continued U-boat construction and deployment, but the successes were statistical outliers that didn't reflect the typical experience of submarines operating in the Atlantic. For every boat that managed to sink a merchant ship, 10 others completed patrols without firing torpedoes or were destroyed while attempting attacks. The interrogation program at Fort Hunt and other Allied facilities gradually assembled a comprehensive picture of German submarine operations from the perspective of crews who'd actually experienced them. The transcripts revealed that ordinary submariners had developed remarkably accurate understanding of their strategic situation, even when headquarters refused to acknowledge reality. Enlisted crew members would discuss among themselves how every patrol seemed more dangerous than the last, how boats were disappearing at rates that exceeded replacement, how the few submarines that returned from patrol reported conditions that made future operations appear hopeless. What the crew members couldn't access was the statistical evidence that would have confirmed their intuitive assessment. They knew conditions had become terrible, but they didn't know that convoy loss rates had dropped to 1%. They understood that U-boats were dying frequently, but they didn't know the casualty rate had reached 75%. They suspected the campaign had failed strategically, but they had no way to verify that suspicion against official pronouncements claiming submarines remained Germany's most effective weapon against Allied logistics. The interrogators found that showing prisoners actual statistics often triggered immediate and profound reactions. Oberleutnant zur See Heinrich Müller, captured when U-421 was sunk in October 1943, initially refused to believe convoy loss figures below 2%. He argued that his own boat had sunk 4 merchant ships during previous patrols, so obviously submarines were achieving significant results. When interrogators showed him Royal Navy records proving that 2 of those claimed kills had actually survived and reached port, Müller spent several minutes in silence before asking how many other U-boat successes were similarly fabricated. The question revealed the deeper psychological crisis. If commander reports couldn't be trusted, then German submarine crews had been risking their lives based on institutional delusions about effectiveness. If headquarters didn't know true convoy loss rates, then strategic planning was based on fantasy. If the entire campaign had failed while authorities continued claiming success, then what other aspects of Germany's war effort might be similarly disconnected from reality? Some prisoners processed these revelations by becoming cooperative sources of technical intelligence. Others withdrew into depression that concerned the medical staff monitoring interrogation facilities. A few maintained that regardless of statistics, they'd done their duty and that moral responsibility lay with leadership rather than frontline personnel. The range of reactions suggested that confronting the truth about submarine campaign failure was psychologically comparable to the combat stress that had preceded capture. British naval intelligence debated whether showing prisoners accurate statistics was ethically appropriate given the psychological impact. Some officers argued that prisoners deserved to understand what they'd actually been fighting for, even if that understanding was painful. Others contended that deliberately inducing psychological distress in prisoners violated civilized standards of conduct. The debate was resolved pragmatically. Statistics would be shown to prisoners who seemed psychologically stable enough to process the information without suffering breakdown. The statistical revelations also served Allied intelligence purposes beyond interrogation. Prisoners who understood how completely the U-boat campaign had failed were more likely to provide detailed information about German naval operations, technologies, and future planning. They'd explain tactical procedures, because those procedures demonstrably hadn't worked. They'd describe equipment specifications because that equipment had proven inadequate. They'd discuss training methods because that training had prepared them for situations that no longer existed. One particularly valuable intelligence source was Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Luth, though he was never actually captured by the Allies. Luth commanded multiple successful patrols through 1943 before being assigned to training duties. In that role, he had access to comprehensive data about U-boat losses and diminishing effectiveness. Luth's training lectures to new submarine crews became progressively darker as 1943 turned to 1944. He told graduating classes that they should expect to die during their first patrol, that survival required paranoia and constant vigilance, that the campaign they were joining had already been lost strategically, even though operations continued. These lectures were reported to Dönitz by officers who found them defeatist and damaging to morale. Luth was reprimanded but not removed from his position because experienced submarine commanders were too valuable to waste. His lectures continued with slight modifications, less emphasis on strategic futility, more focus on specific survival techniques. But the underlying message remained clear to anyone listening carefully. The institutional leadership knew the campaign had failed and was sending men to die anyway because acknowledging failure would require confronting uncomfortable questions about competence and judgment. The broader German military establishment had similar dynamics operating across multiple campaigns by late 1943. The Eastern Front had reversed after Stalingrad, North Africa had been lost, Italy was being invaded. Strategic bombing was destroying German industrial capacity. But institutional momentum and refusal to acknowledge failure kept resources flowing to operations that couldn't achieve meaningful objectives. The submarine campaign epitomized this dysfunction. By any rational assessment, U-boat operations after May 1943 were consuming far more German resources than they damaged Allied logistics. Each submarine required approximately 500 workers, 6 months to construct. Training a crew took 12 to 18 months, including specialized schools for torpedomen, radio operators, engine mechanics, and command staff. Every boat that departed port represented enormous investment in labor, materials, and training that would almost certainly be lost without equivalent return. If those resources had been redirected to coastal defense, or mine warfare, or even simple mine production, they would have generated better strategic results than sending submarines into the Atlantic, where escort carriers and long-range aircraft could hunt them with impunity. But redirecting resources would have required admitting that the submarine campaign had failed, and that admission would have raised questions about leadership competence that nobody in positions of authority wanted to answer. The statistics that broke captured submariners psychologically in interrogation rooms were available to German naval headquarters throughout this period. The intelligence staff could have calculated actual convoy loss rates by comparing claimed sinkings against known submarine losses and doing basic probability mathematics. They could have recognized that if claims were accurate, each submarine was sinking multiple ships before being destroyed. But if claims were inflated, then submarines were being lost faster than they damaged Allied shipping capacity. The staff chose not to perform those calculations, partly because the results would have contradicted official narratives, partly because analyzing their own failures would have required intellectual honesty that careers were built on avoiding, and partly because the alternative to continued submarine operations was acknowledging that Germany's one effective weapon against Allied logistics had been neutralized by technologies the German engineering establishment had dismissed as impossible. This final point created particular institutional pain. German engineers had concluded in 1941 that centimetric radar was impractical because available vacuum tube technology couldn't generate sufficient power at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. They'd presented their findings to naval leadership as established fact. When British aircraft began detecting submarines with centimetric radar in early 1943, the engineering establishment had to choose between admitting their assessments were wrong or finding alternative explanations for submarine losses. They chose alternative explanations. German engineers proposed that British aircraft were detecting METOX receiver emissions rather than using new radar. They designed the Naxos detector to counter a technology that didn't exist while remaining blind to the actual threat. They validated their own incorrect assumptions through testing that confirmed METOX emissions were detectable, while never questioning whether that detection method was actually being used. The institutional failure compounded across multiple domains. Intelligence failed to identify Allied technologies. Engineering failed to develop effective countermeasures. Operations continued sending submarines into situations those boats couldn't survive. Training prepared crews for conditions that no longer existed. And leadership refused to acknowledge that the entire system had become dysfunctional because acknowledgement would require accepting responsibility for catastrophic waste. Klaus Bargsten sat in the Fort Hunt interrogation room, understanding all of this, in the moment Lieutenant Commander Riheldaffer showed him convoy statistics. The numbers weren't just data points about merchant ship losses. They were evidence that everything Bargsten had been told about the submarine campaign was false. His training had been based on obsolete doctrine. His patrols had accomplished nothing strategically meaningful. His crew members had died for a mission that headquarters knew was failing but continued anyway. Bargsten asked Riheldaffer a question that appeared in multiple interrogation transcripts from different prisoners. "Did your leadership know all along that we couldn't win in the Atlantic?" The interrogator's answer was carefully phrased to avoid giving strategic information, but the essence was yes. Allied Naval Command had recognized by mid-1943 that convoy defenses had become effective enough to reduce losses below sustainable attack rates. They'd known that escort carriers and centimetric radar had neutralized submarine advantages. They'd understood that continuing operations would bleed the U-boat force without achieving meaningful damage. The difference was that Allied leadership had responded to that understanding by expanding anti-submarine warfare capabilities. More escort carriers were built. Additional very long-range patrol aircraft were deployed. Hunter-killer groups were formed specifically to destroy submarines, rather than just defend convoys. The system that was already working was improved until it became overwhelming. German leadership had responded to similar understanding by denying it was accurate and continuing operations based on assessments from 1942. The result was exactly what statistics predicted: catastrophic losses, minimal strategic impact, and institutional collapse, masked by propaganda claiming victories that didn't exist. The final casualty figures told the complete story. German submarines sank approximately 3,000 Allied merchant ships during the entire war, totaling roughly 14 million tons. That sounds devastating until compared against Allied ship construction, over 52 million tons launched during the war. For every 3 tons German submarines sank, Allied shipyards built 11 tons of new capacity. The tonnage war that Dönitz believed would starve Britain was lost by ratios exceeding 3-1 in favour of the Allies. The human costs were similarly one-sided but inverted. Allied merchant navies lost approximately 36,000 sailors killed. German submarine service lost 30,000 men killed from 40,000 who served. The convoy escorts, aircraft crews, and shipyard workers who defeated the U-boat threat suffered relatively minor casualties, while inflicting catastrophic losses on the force attacking them. Those statistics became visible to German submariners only after capture, when interrogators showed them documentation that couldn't be dismissed as propaganda. The psychological impact of learning that their sacrifices had achieved virtually nothing while costing more than Allied defensive operations broke many prisoners more thoroughly than combat stress had. Some never fully processed the revelation, preferring to maintain belief in alternative narratives where their service had meaning, even if the campaign failed. Others accepted the truth and tried to extract lessons that might prevent future generations from being sacrificed to institutional delusions. Wolfgang Luth survived until May 14, 1945, when he was accidentally shot by a German sentry who didn't recognize him in darkness. Before his death, Luth had written extensively about submarine operations and the institutional failures that made them unsustainable. His work remained classified for decades after the war, but eventually became source material for historians studying how military organizations can continue catastrophically failed operations through refusal to acknowledge reality. The broader lessons extended beyond submarine warfare to questions about institutional decision-making under stress. Organizations can become invested in narratives that justify past decisions, even when evidence clearly shows those decisions were wrong. Leadership can prioritize career protection over mission effectiveness. Intelligence systems can filter information to support preferred conclusions, rather than challenge existing assumptions. And ordinary personnel can recognize that operations are failing while lacking the institutional power to stop them. The German submarine campaign embodied all these failures simultaneously. The result was 30,000 men killed in operations that achieved minimal strategic impact after mid-1943. Those men weren't less capable than Allied sailors. Their boats weren't inferior to Allied vessels. Their technology wasn't fundamentally worse than Allied equipment. What failed was the institutional system that continued sending them into situations where technology gaps and numerical disadvantages made success impossible. Klaus Bargsten was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He testified during post-war naval investigations about U-boat operations and the disconnect between headquarters assessments and frontline reality. His testimony contributed to historical understanding of how technological surprise combined with institutional dysfunction, to turn a German advantage in 1941 into catastrophic defeat by 1943. Bargsten spent the rest of his life refusing interviews about his submarine service, telling family members that discussing it meant revisiting knowledge that men he'd served with died for operations that leadership knew had failed. That knowledge, the revelation of statistical truth that shattered assumptions about effectiveness and purpose, was perhaps the final cruelty inflicted on German submarine crews. They'd endured conditions that would break most people. Months submerged in steel tubes, constant threat of death by drowning or implosion, psychological stress from being hunted by technologies they couldn't detect. And after surviving all that to reach capture, they learned their suffering had accomplished virtually nothing while costing more than it inflicted. The 1% convoy loss rate that Bargsten saw in September 1943 remained roughly constant through the end of the war. 3,000 Allied ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys between September 1943 and May 1945. 32 were sunk by U-boats. That's 1.07%. The number Bargsten couldn't initially believe proved to be conservative, if anything. The true loss rate during the final 20 months of war was marginally higher than the figure that broke him psychologically. Those statistics represented triumph of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and institutional adaptability over tactical skill and operational experience. They demonstrated that wars are decided by systems rather than individual heroism, by production capacity rather than fighting spirit, by organizational competence rather than personal courage. The German submariners who learned this truth after capture had to reconcile their lived experience of combat stress and comradeship with statistical evidence that their campaign had been hopeless from the moment Allied technology closed. The gap that had made submarines effective. Some never managed that reconciliation. They spent post-war years insisting that statistics must be incomplete or that their own service had meaning regardless of strategic outcomes. Others accepted the numbers and tried to find purpose in survival itself, in having endured conditions that killed 75% of their comrades, in having witnessed history, even if their role in that history was tragic rather than heroic. The escorts and aircraft crews who achieved those 1% loss rates received little recognition compared to more glamorous combat roles. Escort carrier pilots didn't achieve ace status flying anti-submarine patrols. Destroyer crews manning Hedgehog mortars didn't receive the publicity given to battleship sailors. The merchant seamen who crossed the Atlantic repeatedly, knowing each voyage carried risk of torpedo attack, remained largely invisible in popular narratives about the war. But their collective achievement, reducing convoy losses from 20% in early 1942 to 1% by late 1943, was among the most strategically significant accomplishments of the entire conflict. Without that achievement, the invasion of Normandy would have been impossible. Britain would have faced starvation or surrender. The European war would have continued for years longer, with millions of additional deaths. Every division landed in France, every ton of supplies delivered to Britain, every aircraft that bombed Germany depended on merchant ships that crossed the Atlantic safely because convoy defences had reached effectiveness, levels that made submarine attacks suicidal. The German submariners who collapsed psychologically after learning the truth about convoy success weren't weak or cowardly. They were people confronting evidence that their sacrifices had been wasted by institutional leadership that refused to acknowledge technological and strategic defeat. That confrontation with wasted sacrifice may be among the most psychologically devastating experiences humans can face. It retroactively strips meaning from suffering that was endured under the assumption it served important purpose. Klaus Bargsten's reaction, staring at convoy statistics for a full minute before pushing them away and declaring them impossible, captured the moment when institutional delusion collided with documented reality. The numbers on that paper represented more than merchant ship survival rates. They represented proof that German submarine operations had failed completely while authorities continued claiming success. They demonstrated that technology gaps leadership dismissed as impossible had become operational reality. And they revealed that everything Bargsten had been told about his service was false. That revelation, multiplied across thousands of German submariners who survived to capture or lived to see post-war documentation, marked the final defeat of the U-boat force. Not the tactical defeat that occurred during May 1943 when 41 submarines were destroyed. Not the strategic defeat when Dönitz withdrew boats from convoy routes. But the psychological defeat that came from understanding that even after those defeats, operations had continued for 2 more years, achieving nothing except adding to casualty statistics, while leadership pretended effectiveness that statistics proved didn't exist. The 1% convoy loss rate stands as monument to that defeat. 3,000 ships crossed, 30 were lost. The rest delivered their cargo, sustained Britain, enabled the invasion of Europe, and won the war that German submarines were supposed to prevent through tonnage attrition. The mathematics were brutally simple and psychologically devastating for anyone who'd believed the campaign served strategic purpose. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.